Please hold whilst we connect you to Redacted.
This is Lucy Bishop.
This is Fraser Greenfield.
And this is Tim Perry. And you're listening to Redacted.
Tim Perry is a veteran in the design and consulting world with over 25 years of experience. Based in the UK, Tim has experience working in fast-moving consumer goods, consumer electronics, and mobility. You might have seen his work with brands like the ubiquitous Fairy and Dawn dish detergent bottle for Procter & Gamble, Hugo Boss's original men's skincare, pre-iPhone Nokia phones, and the good stuff at Logitech. He currently teaches business growth and commercial skills to design businesses across the world, sharing his experience and insight to help others flourish. Welcome to the show, Tim, and thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Redacted.
For those who may not be familiar with who you are, who's Tim Perry in 100 words or less?
I trained in industrial design, and I guess at a high level, my professional journey has navigated a route upstream from originally working on hands-on design into later strategy and consulting work. Along the way, I worked at Nokia, and I was lucky I caught the last of the pre-iPhone glory years when we had about 50% market share and were selling somewhere around 1 million phones a day. Later, I ran a brand strategy, innovation and design consultancy called Web Devlam. My partner and I grew it to around 100 people across offices in London, Chicago, and Singapore, and ultimately sold it. Now I work independently and I offer 3 things. Firstly, design and innovation strategy consulting. Second is growth advice. And lastly, training in commercial skills for creatives. My mission nowadays is to help designers secure the value that we deserve, and that's either from our employers or our clients.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in industrial design?
As a kid, I always loved drawing and making things, which I guess is a familiar story. It's how most people get into design. I studied maths, physics, and design and thought I was going to become an engineer. And then one day my dad took me to the Royal College of Art's degree show, and that was it. I knew I wanted to study design from then on. I'd always loved cars, so when we went into the room where the transport designers had all of their amazing drawings on the wall, my mind was made up. I applied for, and I was really lucky to get into the transport design course at Coventry in the UK, which at the time was the only place in Europe that you could study transport design at undergrad level. But I realized pretty quickly when I got there that I was a bit different to most of my course mates. They just loved drawing cars and were doing that all day, every day. And although I liked cars, I found I was much more interested in the front end of the design process, which meant solving problems.
I feel like car guys are a certain type, aren't they?
Yeah, and especially in my day, it was almost all guys as well. Drawing cars all day, every day, might as well have been making brum brum noises as they sketched.
Let me guess, were they also doing a black market trade on Hot Wheels as well?
Probably. This was pre-eBay, I'm afraid. Redacted.
What were the big surprises and struggles of moving from designing to strategy?
Well, like many or most, I guess, design consultancies, my company was trying to row upstream into what we hoped would be higher value insight and strategy work, all the stuff that comes before we actually did the executional design. But the difficulty was our clients knew us for designing physical stuff, and they'd point to it and they'd say, I want one of those. And we realized that it was our own fault. Our website was full of physical objects, and we had them on glass shelves in our studios under lights like museum pieces. And often that was pieces of packaging, a plastic bottle sitting on a glass shelf under a light as though it's in an exhibition. We switched to talking much more about understanding people and how brands that we worked with fit into their lives. And that meant taking all the products off the shelves in our studio, and instead we replaced them with pictures featuring people using and enjoying the products that we designed. And this made a huge difference, and it made it a lot easier to win the upfront strategic work. But we were always still seen as a design consultancy, which I suppose was no bad thing. And then later, after selling our company, I worked at a strategy-only consultancy called Plan. And although almost all of us were design trained, we didn't really do any executional design work. Our work focused on the upfront research and strategy that would result in a really great design brief. And we referred to it as all of the stuff that's left of brief. And it was really interesting to work from this angle, but we faced the opposite problem to what I'd experienced before at my design company. At the strategy-only consultancy, our clients would love our thinking, but often they'd then ask, but can you show us what it'll look like? And we didn't do that at our company, but we would have to go out and work with partners if we needed that help.
Was it hard giving up that sense of control? And were there times where you see the end product and you're like, whoa, how did that end up getting there from the brief?
I guess so. That's always a danger. I think my passion by then had moved to doing that sort of upfront work. So I enjoyed and found that strategy work very fulfilling and handing it off at that point. Sometimes we'd stay involved as strategic guardians, we'd call it, where we'd act in a consulting role and watch as the design execution took place and provide some guardrails and keep it on track.
One level above the product manager, the strategy manager almost?
Yeah, maybe. I think a guardian is a nice term. Rather than trying to manage it, that feels a bit more confrontational. But yeah, just trying to ensure that the key insights, the key findings, and the really, really important parts of the design brief rose to the top.
And with these partner businesses, how did you find them and how did they find you?
Sometimes it would be other agencies that the clients had on their roster, so they would put us together. Other times, perhaps if it was a smaller client, we would find people, we'd have people in our little black book, and we would partner with people who we'd worked with before usually, and who we knew would work well with us.
Maybe just rolling the time back a bit, you said that you did transport design, but that you eventually transferred into something very different further down the line. Like, how did you make your first big break as a graduate of transport into the Tim we see now?
Well, I graduated in a recession. There were very few design jobs around. I mean, I guess there's very often very few design jobs around.
For reference, which recession is this?
Oh gosh, I'm really going to date myself now, aren't I? I graduated I graduated in 93. I suppose that was the post.com bubble one, is that right?
I think it's the tiger economy crash, but that might be an Asia-specific one. It's when Japan started all going downhill along with the Soviet Union.
It's funny because I found later in my consulting company life, we found that recessions, downturns were often times when we did really well because clients would realize that they had to innovate and change to survive and thrive.
I've also heard it that a lot of really skilled people become redundant and they find it a really great time to start new businesses.
Yeah, it's a time of change, isn't it?
I'm excited to see what's going to be coming out of this downturn.
Yeah, hopefully there's a silver lining coming.
Yeah, hopefully.
For anyone listening in, it was the Black Wednesday or the 1992 Sterling crisis that started that recession. I didn't Google that at all. It purely came off the top of my head. But when you were looking to sell your first business, how does that work exactly? You created a baby, rose it through childhood, and then you just moved it on to someone else. What's that process look like?
The first thing I would say is we got really lucky. You can engineer these situations or attempt to engineer these situations, but you need a tailwind and a slice of luck. And we'd had approaches previously that didn't go anywhere, but this time the acquiring company came along and put a firm offer on the table pretty quickly. So it was very serious. And I guess we just felt the timing was great. We'd risen, as you said, quite quickly previously, so we felt that we were at a peak in our value, but we were sensing changes going on in the sector that we primarily worked in, which was fast-moving consumer goods or consumer packaged goods, as it's known in the US. And we were just seeing a lot of change in the market that we felt was going to be challenging for us ahead. And the CEO of the company that bought us sat opposite my partner and I and pretty much described exactly what we were feeling and said, you will be in a safer place on these troubled waters in amongst the group of companies that we're assembling. It was a tough decision, but ultimately I think it was just right. And like I said, we were just really lucky and the timing was perfect.
You've obviously had a bit of a journey from east to west. Things may have changed over time. Your philosophy might have changed over time. But right now, what would be the key design principles and philosophies that guide your work?
Well, maybe it's with age, maybe perhaps a bit with experience, but I find myself far more conscious of responsible design now. So if we're thinking within the traditional design thinking DVF framework, I would want to always add R, so we have desirable, viable, feasible, and responsible. We should just put a lot more questioning into whether something even has the right to exist nowadays. We really don't need more crap in the world, and that might be physical or digital. I bristle a bit now every time I see the phrase user-centered design.
Or human-centered design.
Well, I'll come to that in a moment, but I think particularly user-centered design because it feels so selfish. It feels so singular. We've trained people to become consumers, just buying and throwing away more and more stuff just so that we can sell them the next shiny new thing. Whereas I think we should be training people to be citizens, part of something bigger, part of communities. And I think, as you said, their human-centered design feels better, but I even prefer Don Norman's modification to humanity-centered design that feels a bit more plural and inclusive of things like social and ethical and planetary considerations. That's maybe getting quite deep and high level, but personally, the overriding principles that guide my work, things that I've always admired and drawn towards, are simplicity and elegance. And that could be a simple or elegant strategy or a concept or a product execution or even just a piece of communication. I just love it when you see a piece of work that in retrospect seems obvious and it makes you feel, God, I wish I'd done that.
There's really elegant, simple solutions that were almost impossible to conceive.
Yeah, or after you see them conceived, you think, that feels like common sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was always a feature here. How has it not been a thing for hundreds and hundreds of years?
Yeah, why has somebody not done that before?
The worst part is I always feel like there's that solution just waiting to be found, and you just can't always uncover it.
Yeah, the simplest solutions are often the most elusive.
Mm.
They feel tantalizingly close sometimes within grasp, but you can't quite get it.
They're on the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like they haunt me.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Don Norman. Every time I go through one of those Norman doors, I think about him, and occasionally I try to explain it to someone outside the field of design, and they just look at me like I'm a crazy person. It's really frustrating now that I know more about it as well, because I'm like, this isn't my fault.
I think it's a curse of designers. We walk around and we look at the world through the lens of, I want to make that better. We just can't switch off the critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. That gets me into trouble quite a bit.
I remember during COVID, the first time I saw doors that you could operate just with your feet. And I remember thinking that I hate touching handles with wet, washed hands. Why isn't this normal and everywhere?
Mm.
Having this little metal foot thing that comes out of the door and you just pull on it or kick on it, depending on whether it's a push or pull. And it's just like, there should be a standard.
So there's a pretty good example of a community-based piece of design, right? Because that's good for you, but it's also good for other users of that door handle.
I've heard a really interesting story that in Canada they outlawed the doorknob because it was deemed not to be accessible. So all the government buildings, they apparently replaced them with levered doors. And then they found out after all the replacements that the bears could get in.
Wow. You've made me think of another example, actually. It's something I can't take any credit for, but a company that I'm advising at the moment, during COVID, did a self-initiated project that they aimed at retailers, and it was for the automated checkout screen. Instead of having a button, the buy now button on the screen in one place for every customer, it sensed where the previous customer had pressed and moved the button for the next customer. And it would do that multiple times around the screen until the screen had been pressed in every area. And then it would alert the staff who would come and wipe it and clean it, and it would start again. So that was a sort of super clever, simple, elegant, community-based solution at the time.
For anyone listening in, shaved doorknobs are against the American Disabilities Act, which makes complete sense because everyone has had that one nightmare where they have wet, slippery hands and they can't get in or out of the bathroom.
Now, did you have to Google that, Fraser?
No, I remembered that one because Lucy's mentioned it to me before.
Have I?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you know more about it than I do. I think I just read one of those random articles on it once.
The Cliff Notes.
Skimmed the headline, got the gist of it.
No, look, honestly, I think it was like a BuzzFeed article or something. I clearly got sucked in by outlawing doorknobs.
Oh, I can just imagine that BuzzFeed title.
They're illegal on government buildings, I should stress, not necessarily at home.
I think they had to bring back the doorknob, though, didn't they?
The round one is against building code. I think it's even against building code here for government buildings and most probably new buildings, but don't quote me on that.
Now you're conjuring images of campaigns. Bring back the doorknob campaign, protests.
The worst design doorknob, we need to bring it back.
We've finally stopped discriminating against the bears, I guess. Bears welcome everywhere.
Redacted.
Hey everyone, this episode is sponsored by PCBWay, the go-to destination for printed circuit board prototyping, low-volume production, and PCB assembly. If your team are working on electronics and you're in need of prototype PCBs, I can't recommend PCBWay enough. You can get a quote instantly, even if your circuit board schematics aren't finished yet. They can also help you with injection molded, 3D printed, sheet metal, and vacuum cast prototypes. PCBWay is the circuit board prototyper of choice for companies like Samsung, Siemens, Honeywell, Tesla, and Apple. But you don't have to be a big company to use their services. I've personally used their service to instantly get quotes and have assembled prototype PCBs delivered in a timely manner. On top of all that, PCBWay is so excited to be working with us. They're offering a special discount just for our listeners. When you get a quote from PCBWay, be sure to use our promo code redacted for a special discount on us. You can find PCBWay in our episode description or go to pcbway.com.
Redacted.
How did you manage the transition from designer to consultant?
I guess it wasn't quite that simple because most of my career has been spent on the agency or consultancy side of the fence. So even when I was a designer, I was still a consultant of sorts. The change happened in stages gradually over the years and started by me becoming just more experienced as a designer and getting in front of clients more, and then beginning to lead projects and even later client accounts. And then I changed. I went and worked in-house at Nokia, which gave me a really interesting perspective from the other side of the fence, being on the buyer side.
Was this in Nokia's office in Finland or somewhere else?
I used to travel into Finland a lot, but I was based in the UK, which was first of all outside of London, then we relocated to Soho. I would travel to the other design studios quite frequently, so Finland, Copenhagen, Los Angeles a couple of times, and even Beijing.
How did you find working in-house?
Oh, gosh, it's interesting because I recommend to people, if they can, fairly early in their career, to try working both sides of the fence, in-house and consultancy side, because one of them usually suits you more. For me, being consultancy side was definitely my thing. I found working in-house was fascinating, taught me all kinds of things, not least seeing people for the first time actively managing their careers, which was really interesting to see. But I found it quite hard to be a small cog in a big machine. I found it hard, honestly, to keep my motivation high when I didn't see as much impact coming from my work. And that was probably because it was fairly early in my career, so I was maybe not quite so close to the sharp end of decision making. To me, I was more comfortable on the consulting side in smaller to mid-size, which became actually quite a large independent consulting business eventually.
What did you mean by actively managing their careers?
At Nokia, there was a bit of a joke that approximately every 2 years there was a reorganization. And so I was seeing people very deliberately attach themselves to a certain senior stakeholder who was rising perhaps rapidly through the organization. They would work very closely with somebody who was a bit of a mover and shaker, or otherwise they would be deliberately putting time into going to the different foreign postings. So I need to go and work here or there and put my time in and actively network with either those teams or certain people. And I'm not sure that's something that is a terribly familiar concept to a design grad. Maybe it is if you come out of business school.
Like a baptism of fire. Like a really quick course on politics.
Yeah, inevitably there was some of that. I think there's politics wherever you work, but at a different scale, at a big company within an in-house team. just seeing that savvy. I'm not criticizing it. I admired it in people that I saw who were doing that. But it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me because previously, like I said earlier, we graduated in a recession. It was about getting any job you could at that time just to get your foot in the door and then following opportunities that generally presented themselves. And I was seeing people who were quite impressively generating opportunities for themselves and following them.
Do you have any tips for people on how they could generate these opportunities for themselves?
I think just being conscious of it, first of all, and looking beyond your immediate bubble at what other people are doing and identifying those movers and shakers within a business who are maybe see the company and the world the same way that you do, who are making some waves, being successful. Put into more official terms, it's developing the skills to manage upwards and sideways, as well as managing downwards.
Would you say those same strategies would be as efficient now in a post-2008 world as they were in the early 2000s or late 90s?
Good question. I haven't worked in an in-house company since then, although I've worked with many big companies. It varies tremendously depending on corporation. Some are very old school and hierarchical that I've worked with and have the corner office principles. And the more senior you are, the higher the floor in the office building you work on. And then others are perhaps a little more progressive and flatter in their organizational principles. So I think it really depends on what kind of company you work at.
Check the landscape before you make a strategy.
Yeah.
Speaking of strategy in your consulting days, one of the things that really comes up when people try and either strike out on their own or maybe their business is starting to plateau, how do you figure out how much you need to charge a client, and where do you recommend others do to set that initial value, that self-value?
Gosh, it can be really difficult. I guess I'm lucky because I've got quite a bit of experience, and having worked at a few places, I've had insight from the inside and seen what quite a few other people charge. The important thing is that you need to strike a balance. On the one hand, you don't want to be too cheap or people won't take you seriously. And of course, you'll earn less if you don't charge enough. But you also need to be competitive. You shouldn't price yourself out of the market. Having high rates is no good if you don't get any work. So I would say start by doing a bit of benchmarking. We should do some research first. And a good source of benchmarks can be design associations. So the Design Business Association, the DBA in the UK, run an annual survey. Maybe the IDSA in the US does something. I'm not sure nowadays.
I believe the DIA have just recently taken a survey in Australia as well.
They're great. They're done anonymously, so hopefully people are being truthful. And it gives you somewhere to start, at least, gets you in the right ballpark. If you don't have access to those design association materials, then recruitment agents are another good place to start. Again, some of them run surveys on salaries and charge out rates. If they don't, just speak to them. Just give them a call and say, hey, I need to figure this out. What would be a ballpark competitive figure? Because they see this, so they should know.
A lot of recruiters also are happy to chat because they want to make the connection as well. Don't feel like you're bugging them because you're probably helping them as well.
Absolutely. And recruiters speak to hundreds, maybe thousands of people. So yeah, get on the phone and speak to them. Don't just send them an email asking them this. Develop a bit of a relationship and a rapport with them. And hopefully then you'll be remembered. And if they do have opportunities that are right for you, they'll give you a call. But really importantly, don't have a set rate. That would be a huge piece of advice I'd give people. What you charge someone really depends on the value that your client places on the work that you're providing, or I guess even your employer places upon you.
Really good point. Yeah.
There's a few ways that you can go about that. Start by asking yourself, what is the client willing or able to pay? For example, they might be a big global corporation or it might be a local business, and they'll have very different budgets. Likewise, what category are they in? If they're a pharmaceutical or a financial services business, they've probably got more money to spend than if they're a charity or working in the third sector. And then you've got to figure out how much they need you. Is the project particularly urgent or important to them? Are you competing against others is another big factor. And you want to know who you're competing against so you can benchmark yourself against them. Are they one-person bands or are they big companies that you're competing against? And if you don't know, then ask. That's a very reasonable thing to do.
The worst they can tell you is nothing, right?
Exactly. The worst they can say is no.
Yeah, and you're basically back to where you were.
If they do say no, my technique is to politely explain that you're likely to be taking a bit of risk in making an investment in trying to secure that piece of work. And you're asking a very reasonable business decision. You want to know the landscape, the context in which you're competing before you run headlong into it. when you've got a fair sense of the competitive context, you've got to be asking yourself, can they get what you provide easily from someone else? And if you think the answer is no, then the value you're providing is probably higher and you can increase your fees a little bit. But if you're easily substitutable, then you're in a slightly more competitive situation and you may need to be a bit more flexible on your rate. And then finally, there's personal things like how much do you want the work? And you might want the work for more reasons than just the money. I always talk about, it's not my phrase, but the 3 Fs. We work for fame, fortune, or fun. Sometimes it could become a really good marketing story for you to take that piece of work. So there's value to you beyond the fees that you garner for that project.
That's a dangerous line to tread when you start talking about maybe, I know this is a dirty word, but working for exposure, or at least subsidizing your price on the basis of exposure. There's this idea that exposure can potentially put you into a bit of a poverty trap, or at least you can spend a lot of time on a project where the amount of time and effort that you put in didn't necessarily pay off. And maybe sometimes it does, and the long-term benefits are worth the investment. But how do you manage that post-mortem process where you analyze what went wrong in a logical way, not an emotional one?
The important thing is that it has to be you making the call. I've been in situations before where a big client with a big name has used that to flex their position. And they've said, oh, you can do it for less money because you're going to get the benefit of the exposure of our brand name in your portfolio, which I didn't appreciate.
Yeah, that's very gross.
Yeah. If it's a decision that you're making yourself, then I think it's okay. And I think that it's part of a bigger point, which is that price is not only set by a client, it's also set by you. And if you make a decision that you value that exposure, or maybe it's helping you get into a category that you'd like to work in that you haven't worked in before, it might be experience that you're gaining rather than exposure. I think that's okay if you're deciding that yourself. And you assess the risks, you assess the price that you charge and the potential subsidy that you agree to, then I think that's okay because it's down to you. It relates to the next thing that I'm going to say, which is just practical factors that should influence the price that you charge. Something as simple as how busy you are at the moment. If you're quiet, and particularly if you've got a team of people that you're having to pay who are quiet, then you might decide quite reasonably to charge a little bit less to a client. The thing is you've got to be careful that you're not setting precedents, because if you set that price once and you come to do another similar project for that same client, then they're going to expect the same deal. That's a watch out.
What do you mean by precedents? As in you get to this point where you end up lowering your fee a little bit every year as opposed to raising it by whatever inflation is?
I meant if you've decided for whatever reason to offer a lower price to a client, that sets the benchmark for your pricing in their minds. So next time they come to you, particularly if it's for a similar project, so the context is quite similar, but maybe you're really busy at that point, or you no longer need the exposure or the experience in the category that you needed the first time around, then they will have got used to that lower price and they will expect that lower price again.
What if you have the opposite problem? What if someone says you're just too expensive?
In my experience, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but it's very rare that you won't win a piece of work purely because you're too expensive. If a client wants to work with you and you are too expensive, they will negotiate. If they tell you that they didn't want to work with you because you were too expensive, there's probably something else that's put them off. To summarize back to your question about how do you set your price, it's a combination ultimately. There's no simple formula for it, but it's a combination of all of those things that should enable you to flex your price up or down. The other overarching piece of advice that I would give is be confident. That old saying, if you don't ask, you don't get. Usually there's room for a conversation. There's room for a negotiation.
And just looping back, because we missed the tail end of it, you ended up leaving Nokia and then becoming a consultant. What was going through your head at that time?
It was a combination of two factors that happened very conveniently at the same time. The first was that the iPhone had launched, so the writing became clearer on the wall of what was happening at Nokia. And the second was that the two founding partners of the design agency that I returned to had decided to leave. And the remaining partner, who was located in the US, gave me a call and said, would you like to come back, be my partner and run the UK studio? the combination of those two things meant it was too good an opportunity to turn down. Bit of serendipity. So after working at Nokia, I went back to the previous business that I was at before Nokia, but this time running it as a partner. And I still had some creative overview, but when you're running a business like that, you have a million other things to deal with that take your focus away from the process of designing. And that can be looking after the people, the property, the finance, and most importantly, and probably the most time-consuming thing is business development. That was another step in that transition from designer to consultant. And then another one was moving into the pure strategy business after selling that business. Now, to complete the transition to consultant, as well as doing that strategy work, I've moved into offering the advisory and training services. If I were to sum up that transition from designer to consultant, for me at least, it's been about learning to talk less about myself and my work, and spending more time and energy understanding other people's challenges. And the key technique that comes into play there is asking them more and better questions. Designer to consultant is talk less about yourself and ask more questions about other people.
I can't even imagine what it would have been like being at Nokia the day after that famous keynote speech.
I'm not sure I want to go into that.
No, that's totally reasonable. It's just an interesting thought.
People have written books on that. I replied to a post about it not long ago. It has become a very famous case study, hasn't it? Now it's up there with the Kodak.
Or Windows phones need keyboards. iPhones don't have keyboards, they won't sell.
I mean, there were a number of reasons, I suppose.
I mean it from that perspective. I was just interested. Did they know straight away? Were they like, this is a gimmick, it's not going to catch on? No.
They think they had time to catch up.
I don't necessarily think of Nokia in the same category as Kodak at all. I've never connected those two stories.
Maybe that's just me being sensitive.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to ask such a pointy question.
No, that's okay.
Being on the ground when that thing launched, all the cool kids had BlackBerry phones and the rest of us were rocking Nokias. It didn't necessarily seem like the iPhone was going to take off. It was going to be the Palm Pilot, a phone for rich people, at least for the first year or two.
That's my recollection.
It definitely took a long time in the circle I was in for the iPhones to really infiltrate.
That's my recollection of it, is that it wasn't, as you said, Lucy, this overnight terror when Steve Jobs stood up on the stage. It probably should have been more the case.
Launched without the App Store, didn't it? You couldn't download apps?
It was iTunes, wasn't it, originally, because it migrated from iPod and iTunes. So I think apps came along a little bit later.
Yeah, because I feel like that was really the turning point.
I think there was denial at first. Like I said earlier, Nokia was selling something like 1 million phones a day, but an awful lot of those were in developing markets, and I liked to say they were selling phones for about the price of a pizza. Whereas the iPhone came along, and I think it was somewhere around $600 at the time. And of course, that was just the start, because then people would spend money on iTunes and later the App Store. So there would be lots of future revenue. And I think the feeling at Nokia within senior management was, this is a phone for the highly involved tech nerds who are prepared to spend $600 on a phone. They might get 5% of the market, let them have it. That's my recollection, at least, of the initial reaction to it. And then when you said, Fraser, about catching up, interestingly, an awful lot of the features and functions of the iPhone had been kicking around within the Nokia walls for a number of years. And I believe even some of the iPhone features were licensed patents from Nokia.
It's interesting how you say it's for the 5% tech nerds, because I feel like that's similar to how people see the Vision Pro currently. Oh, that's only for this very small subset of very niche users.
Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a lesson in there somewhere.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee that every big product that is widely loved in the design space is going to be successful. I think the takeaway would be Apple tends to take a lot of risks. So they've had a lot of small Macs like the G4 They did a hi-fi system in 2006 that bombed. And then there was the Mac Pro that looked a bit like a rubbish bin that just didn't seem to go anywhere, as well as the original HomePod. Did Nokia have an attitude where they just didn't want to take too many risks and maybe that didn't work out?
Definitely. A lot of friends of mine at the time said, so how come Nokia, who's been making phones for all of these years, didn't come up with the iPhone and Apple did? And I said, well, maybe that's the exact reason, because Nokia had all of the legacy. And don't forget success. Nokia had an incredibly successful business, was doing really, really well, the clear market leader. The motivation to change is lower then compared to when you're a challenger. And there was all sorts of legacy systems and processes, operating system, for example, in place that prevented that clean sheet of paper, beginner's mind approach to launching something new. I think there was another common misconception, which was that Nokia believed that the phones at the time were easy to use. And I think the iPhone came along and was genuinely easy to use, whereas Nokia's were familiar. And that's a very different thing.
That's a really good point and differentiating feature as well.
And quite quickly, more and more people realized that the iPhone was not for the 5-10% tech nerds. It was genuinely easier to use for everybody.
Circling back more on your consulting experience, would there be any tips that you'd hand out to people when things have gone bad and you've lost a project, a client, or that very important pitch that you really needed?
I actually have a course in just that called Turning Losing into Winning. And it's all about that. How do you recover from losing a project or a client or a pitch? And the main thing is don't give up. We tend to pour our hearts and souls into winning a piece of work. And if we're not successful, we tend to get despondent. We cry into our beer a little bit. We dust ourselves off and we move on. But we shouldn't. I've found some of my very best client relationships over the years started with a loss. And the reason is because the process of trying to win that piece of work teaches you a lot. You learn all kinds of things about the client, and they learn all kinds of things about you. The process has given you exposure to them that you wouldn't otherwise have got. Perhaps the piece of work that you lost wasn't suited to you. That's often the case when it's the first piece of work that you're trying to win from a client. They don't yet understand you and what you're really good at, or you represent a bit of a risk to them. They've got other safe options and they haven't worked with you before, so you're a bit of a risk. And through the process, they may get to know you better and something else might come along that is more suited to you. Or maybe they have a colleague in another team who has some work that's more suited to you and they can refer you. I think it's really, really important not to just put it behind you and move on, just see it as a step in the journey. I like the phrase, try and adopt the mindset of, we lost this battle, but we'll win the war. We'll win the next one.
I feel like it's also important to say that the person that they do go ahead with may not work out for many other reasons as well, or that person might move on to different style of work. It might have been a stepping stone.
Yeah, there are all sorts of things like that can happen, right? They'll come back to you if things don't work out. And I guess that's the reason why you should be very professional in the face of a loss. And certainly you should seek to understand why you weren't successful, because that'll teach you a lot as well. And then take it graciously, offer to help out if something doesn't go right, and express that you're very keen to still work with them at some point in the future.
How do you manage that post-mortem process where you analyze what went wrong in a logical way, not an emotional one?
Oh gosh, again, it's a pretty central part of this course that I teach, which is all about debrief meetings. Really important to start off having an internal debrief meeting. Air all of the grievances. If you've got any frustrations, get them out internally behind closed doors and find out everybody's perspective who worked on the pitch or on the proposal, if that's what it was. And then figure out what it is that you want to ask a client and then arrange a debrief meeting with the client. And find out, ask the question. Again, it's a little bit like asking who you were competing against up front. It's a very reasonable thing to do in a commercial engagement to figure out, after you've taken some risk and made some investment, why were you not successful so that you can be more successful next time. Good clients, and generally clients are good clients, I do believe that, they will give you 30 minutes just to run through some pointers that they can give you for next time. Do that, and then loop back, circle back, and then hold another internal debrief meeting where you can share those learnings with the team. Because everyone's going to be feeling a bit bruised and battered probably, so it's good to help them understand why their efforts weren't successful that time, and so hopefully they'll feel motivated to have another go if you get another chance.
This is Tim Perry.
And you're listening to Redacted.
When it comes to running your own business or stepping up to a more client-facing role, how would you advise how intellectual property is handled in a project contract?
The main thing to understand is who will own the IP and then make sure it's really clearly stated in the contract. If you're a consultancy working for fees, then almost certainly your client will own the IP related to your work, unless you set up an alternative arrangement. In that situation where you're a consultancy working for fees and your client is going to own the IP, the key thing to make sure you include in the contract is that that intellectual property only transfers to them after you've been paid in full.
And what about handling, say, legal liability risk? A lot of industrial design firms might have an engineering team inside, and sometimes that can expose your business if the quality control for a certain product doesn't work, or it turns out that it spontaneously combusts or might be harmful to the user, but it's what the client asked for. How do you protect your business against that sort of thing? Or at least make sure that the best outcome for all parties involved is preordained.
First of all, it's not fair for a company to transfer all of that risk to a consulting business. So I would always advise that that risk is somehow mitigated for you as a consultant by sharing it in some way. So if you can include clauses in a contract that states that the ultimate responsibility lies with the client company before something is released into the public domain, passing any safety tests or any regulations that are required ultimately has to be the responsibility of the client company, because you're just not in a position to be able to guarantee that as a consultant. That's the first thing, is to avoid situations where you find yourselves solely responsible for those kinds of things. And then the second thing is you just never know what's going to happen. Make sure, if you possibly can, that your risk is somehow capped. That can either be through agreeing a figure, and sometimes you will agree a figure based upon your insurance that you hold as a company, and often there are industry standard levels of insurance, and you can explain to your client that's why we have insurance, to prevent a very unlikely situation. And you may say it's never happened before, but in the very unlikely eventuality that it does happen, we have to be able to protect our business. We cannot expose ourselves to the risk of being entirely wiped out. So I think capping your exposure is vital. And if you can align that with the extent of your insurance, that's a good thing to do. Unlimited exposure is just simply not fair.
Maybe a bit later into your career, let's say you've got a few years under your belt. How do you prevent your career from plateauing? I know you've spoken a bit about this on LinkedIn, and it is something that I will have to be concerned about probably in the next couple of years, as the economy is slowing down and the opportunities at the moment might seem to be shrinking.
Yeah, so I've been talking about career progression quite a lot. And the first thing to figure out is, what does progression mean to you? To some people, it's about improving their design skills, developing mastery. To others, it might be about moving into management or leading a team. Other people may prioritize working on projects that mean a lot to them, or working at a company that they admire. A common theme, though, is that we all feel satisfied and fulfilled if somehow we're continuing to learn and develop. And hopefully, all of those different forms of career progression mean picking up some promotions and pay increases on the way. You know, we all have to pay our bills. As I've been writing about it, I use a mountaineering analogy, and I describe a common point where design careers get a bit stuck as base camp. It's not the start of your journey. It tends to happen a few years into our careers. We study design and then we graduate, and then we have the not insignificant challenge of getting our first job. That's usually the big hurdle to get over, to get our foot in the door. Once we do that, our careers then tend to accelerate quite quickly. We learn really fast, and hopefully we get a few promotions. Maybe it's at one company, sometimes it's by jumping between companies. And as I said before, hopefully we pick up a few pay increases along the way at that point. But then we get to this point where the progression can flatten off quite easily, or at least slow down a bit. And that's the point that I call base camp. It can be a really important turning point. I've observed careers then going in one of a number of ways. Firstly, you can largely continue what you're doing. That's often described as being an individual contributor or an IC. And your design skills get better, but basically you carry on delivering the same value to your company. You might enjoy that. You enjoy the mastery that you're gaining. But if you put yourself in the shoes of your employer, it's very difficult for them to continue rewarding you with promotions and pay increases when this happens, because you're essentially delivering the same value to them. So it's very hard for them to continue increasing your pay.
Or at least it's very hard to quantify that you mastered this skill that brought in so much more money than what you would have at this point last year.
A typical way that it tends to get valued is in time. So you're able to deliver the same amount of value, but in a shorter period of time. You've become faster. You're right, Lucy. It is really difficult to quantify, but time is one measure of it. To some people, that's great. That's what they enjoy doing. That's what they got into the industry for in the first place. But I think it's quite important to acknowledge that if you also are seeking promotions and pay increases, it's going to be a bit more challenging if that's the path that you choose. The second route from Basecamp is going into management, and that often happens accidentally. You start by picking up some more responsibility, maybe looking after a few projects, smaller ones at first, and maybe some junior staff have joined the company since you did, and you start looking after them. And that'll give your career a bit of a bump, but probably not much of one, or it'll happen fairly slowly over time. But then the third one, which is based upon my own personal experience of my career looking back, and it's why I developed the commercial skills training, is that the biggest boost you can give to your career is by acquiring commercial skills, particularly if you're working at a consultancy. I realized that bringing in new work is the lifeblood of any consulting business. So the more directly you can contribute to bringing revenue through the door, it doesn't have to be from new clients, it can be from existing clients. If you do that, back to your point, Lucy, it becomes an awful lot easier to measure and to quantify, but it will be almost impossible for the people who run that business not to give you dramatic progress in your career if you're doing that. You become so valuable to that consultancy.
To caveat to that, at least in my experience working with consultancies, they wouldn't necessarily let you exercise those commercial skills if you already had them. How do you convince someone who owns the business, has been a partner for 20 years, to let you look for new clients in maybe the more quieter hours?
Gosh, I have to say I haven't experienced that barrier before, because later, of course, I became that person running my own consultancy. And the superstars of my business were those people who adopted that entrepreneurial mindset and shared in that responsibility for bringing business into the company. I think it would be nuts for someone to stand in their way, frankly. If someone can contribute to that, it's gold dust. A phrase that I often hear from people who perhaps aren't getting that kind of support is that they would just love more people to spread the load. That's the phrase that I hear. I'd be astonished if a business leader stood in the way of somebody who could contribute to bringing revenue into an agency or consultancy. That'd be madness to me.
Redacted.
How do you lay out objectives and define with the client what a successful outcome looks like?
Well, I think the clue's in your question. The key is start with the desired outcomes and then work backwards. A really useful technique is project forward to the time when your work is done, and then ask yourself and maybe your teammates and even your client, what needs to have happened for us to have been successful? And then work back from there. The next thing I'd say is don't confuse outcomes with outputs. Think of outcomes as things that have changed, whereas outputs are deliverables. And they may help you get there, but outcomes are a different thing. The objectives that you should set should be directly linked to those desired outcomes. Usually you'll find that your objectives are simply a breakdown of what needs to be done to reach the outcomes.
You've spoken a bit about how networking is a great way to find potential client leads. But of course, there must be other avenues. If you're looking for new leads, new clients, in your experience, what are some good ways of finding those leads? And then how do you sort those leads into high risk or high value?
I think as an industry in design, we're very guilty of being inward looking, which is a little ironic because we profess to be so user-centric. We're terribly guilty of showing beautiful renderings of our work with little to no mention of the benefits either to the users or, more importantly, often the commercial value to the businesses who've commissioned us. And then there's all the self-congratulatory industry awards, which I won't get started on. To generate those leads, we need to get much better at communicating outcomes and impact of our work. And we need to do that in terms not that our peers, our fellow designers will value. And it's quite hard to break out of that. I find myself posting on LinkedIn thinking, what are my peers going to think of this? And you have to break out of that mindset into what are my clients and prospects going to think of this? Have I articulated this in a way that they will, first of all, understand and second, find motivating? There continues to be a lot of talk about specializing as a way of finding leads. Specializing usually means in an industry sector. I think there's a space for generalists too. Perhaps it's about developing a specialist approach rather than a specialist sector. But above all, I think a way of finding new leads is to develop your point of view. It's not something that everybody agrees with, but it'll resonate really strongly with some people. I think you then find that you start attracting people to you. So rather than going out and selling yourself, you talk about your point of view, and hopefully it's interesting and hopefully it's motivating to some people and they gravitate towards you. Mine, for example, and not everybody agrees with this, is the value of commercial skills to creatives. I do find that there are people who are interested in my point of view and come to me and ask me questions. That's a key way to attract leads rather than going out and finding them.
So it's a bit like defining your value proposition for your own personal brand or your consultancy's brand.
Yeah, it's no different. We're offering a service and we hope to attract users of that service.
What about sorting those leads when they do eventually come in?
This is all about qualification. It's vital to do a really thorough assessment upfront before you decide on how much you're going to invest in trying to win that piece of work. If you've got a lead, you need to decide, how much am I going to put into going after that lead to try to secure it? Or should I even go after it at all? You may ascertain that some pieces of work could be very high risk, but it's worth it because the reward or the value to you is also very high. So it could be fine to go after that, but you're going into it with your eyes open. You understand the context before you jump in. You're not just blindly chasing after it. This qualification process should be rigorous and structured and very deliberate. Fundamentally, it comes down to two things. You need to determine, first of all, what is the size or the shape of the opportunity? What's its value to you? That doesn't just mean monetary value, could be other forms of value. And then secondly, what's your chance of winning it? And the decision on then how you proceed in terms of, do you chase after it at all? And if you do, how much effort and investment do you put into chasing after it? Comes out of those two factors.
The size and shape of an opportunity can be very immaterial because they might go, oh, we'll stick with you for years and years. Other times they'll talk about potential exposure, or even you're going to have enough creative freedom that you can post about it. You can have it on your website. If it's well executed, you can draw in more work with that work. But there's risks involved with all of that. And sometimes I wonder, and I'm sure plenty of businesses are guilty of cutting your nose despite your face. How do you balance the opportunity costs of the immaterial rewards versus the money which you might need right now?
I mean, there's no set formula for it, right? It's got to be down to you. What I'm saying is that you just need to make as informed a decision as you possibly can. And very often that means asking questions of your prospect that can be quite uncomfortable to try to gain that understanding of the situation, because what they're telling you is probably not the whole story. You need to get as much information as you possibly can so you can make that value judgment. I think really importantly, remember that when you work with a client as a consultancy or as an agency, the decision to work together is not just one way. It's not just the client that decides whether to work with you. You have it within your power whether to work with them. And it's perfectly okay to back away if you think that either the fit's not right or the chance of you winning it is low. It's within our power as well to count work out.
I guess sometimes you do have to back out of the pitch or even fire the client later down the road.
Maybe it's even before choosing to participate in it, where you might explain to a client, you know what, this isn't for us. This isn't our superpower. Often a great thing to do in that situation is to recommend somebody else. If you want someone who's really good at this, go and work with so-and-so, but it's not for us. And if you're honest with a client that way, next time they speak to you and you say, hey, yeah, this falls right within our wheelhouse, this is what we're great at, they're far more likely to believe you because you've built that trust with them the first time round by telling them, no, that you know what, we're probably not the right people for you. And you've saved yourself a huge amount of time and effort chasing after something that you probably wouldn't have won.
I was looking for a job and it was in an area that I hadn't previously had experience in. I'd made it to one of the final few candidates where they presented me with the opportunity to do a paid design test. And I've asked them what level of experience the other candidates who were also doing the design test were operating on, because I want to know that I have a chance of actually winning the work. They explained to me that one had previously owned a business doing that work and another had about 4 years experience. I was like, oh, okay. So what are the metrics that you're actually going to be critiquing us on? Is it originality? Is it ready for market? Is it market insights? And it was clear that they were not expecting any of these questions. It wasn't even pushback, but they actually just never ended up calling me again, which honestly was a blessing because clearly either I wasn't going to get that job because I wasn't experienced enough, or they were concerned about my level of questioning, which in itself I think is a really big red flag.
For them, not for you.
I think you did a great job because you came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be a good fit. And you just in there, by the way, raised a really, really important point about qualification, which is asking exactly as you did, what is the criteria against which we will be judged?
Maybe a fresh mindset is what you need. Maybe you need someone from another industry to come in and have a look at things at a different way. And I see value in that, but do you?
That's qualification. It's a fancy industry jargon word, but you've just done exactly what I'm suggesting people should do before jumping in.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were doing the right thing by offering to pay me, but it still doesn't mean I want to necessarily do the work for no reason.
Redacted.
Tim, what do you want your legacy to be?
Ooh, well, it might sound a bit cheesy, but a lot of the work I do now feels like giving back. Of course, I make a living out of it, but it's really gratifying to help people out, whether it's through a great piece of strategy or some advice to an agency or consultancy owner or training to someone who's a little earlier in their career. It feels a little bit like how you remember your favorite teacher from school. We normally have pretty fond memories of that favorite teacher, and we talk about how they helped us and the impact they had on our future path. If I can get close to that, it's a pretty cool way to be remembered.
Thank you, Tim, for coming onto the show today. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing your story and all those helpful insights.
Thanks very much for having me too. I've been a long-time fan of your podcast, so it's been great to appear on it, and I really enjoyed the conversation. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about what I do, if that's interesting, then please go to my website. You'll see it's divided into strategy, advice, and training with some videos that will tell you more about it. And the URL is tp-consulting.co.uk.
Don't forget to check the show notes for any links to Tim's work, his courses, and more, where to follow the show and contact us. Until next time, you've been listening to Redacted.
The number you have dialed has not been recognized. Please check and try again. The number you have dialed has been
Redacted.